Hi, I'm Chris Nesi from the House of EdTech Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to right now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
The Clark County Public Schools, Virginia, is seeking a superintendent beginning August 1st, 2024. Located in Berryville, Virginia, just south of Winchester, Clark County Public Schools serves 1,924 students in their 4 accredited schools: Boyce and D.G. Cooley Elementary Schools, Johnson Williams Middle School, and a new Clark County High School. The district's manageable size promotes visibility, inclusion, relationships, and transparency. The firm of Hazard, Young, and Attia, HYA, is conducting the search, and leading the search are associates Drs. Sam DePaul and Daryl Williams. They can be reached at samuel.depaul@hyasearch.com and daryl.williams@hyasearch.com. Visit the Clark County Public Schools website at clark.k12.va.us for more information about the district, and also visit HYA's website, hyasearch.com. Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Jeremy S. Adams. That's right, he's back on the show, which means he's got a new book. And his book is called Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. What a powerful book. What an incredible talk. You are going to love this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Oh, by the way, make sure you share it with your friends, your family, your colleagues, your neighbors, because they're going to want to go out and buy a copy of his book as well, because they are going to be so inspired. Thanks for listening. Oh, by the way, before you go, it'd be so cool if you took time to help out the podcast. And I got some ideas for how you could do that. 1, you could tell a friend and share the links. 2, go to my website and leave a review and subscribe. And 3, you could click on the link on my website homepage to buy me a coffee. Right, you go there, you click on that link, and by doing this, you could donate $1 or $2 to help me address the costs associated with producing the podcast. What do you think? You're so cool. Thanks for doing that. Thanks for listening. And by the way, enjoy the show.
And yet I would tell you that I don't think our essential humanity has changed. I think that the way that we reach happiness, the way that we walk on a path of human flourishing hasn't changed all that much. And I think there are a lot of timeless truths about the human condition that some of the greatest Americans who have ever lived understood.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Miletto. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12. With Dr. Steve Miletto.
Jeremy S. Adams has taught at Bakersfield High School for 26 years. He is the Daughters of the American Revolution 2014 California Teacher of the Year. His writing has appeared in Newsweek, the LA Times, the Washington Post, and countless other outlets. He is an Amazon best-selling author, and his newest book is entitled Lessons in Liberty, 30 Lessons for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans, published by HarperCollins. You're going to love this. Hey, Jeremy, it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining me, and say hi to everybody.
Hey, everybody. It's good to be back a 4th, 5th time. I've got to be at the top of the mountain here for your show.
Oh, you definitely are. I've had you for each book. So we're at 4 books. And so this is the 5th book, which kudos on that, man.
I feel like I need to get a gift card or something.
No, I wouldn't. Maybe we could. I don't know.
Well, maybe I should give the gift card to you. What am I thinking?
Hey, now I wouldn't turn that down.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Exactly.
But it's great to have you on. I mean, we've talked about Hollowed Out, Riding the Wave, The Secrets of Timeless Teachers, and Full Classrooms, Empty Selves. And you've got a new one out, which we're going to get to in just a minute. But before we go there, you're becoming the word prolific now needs to start coming in front of your name there.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. Some people are able to pump out lots of books, sometimes a year. No, I'm, and it's kind of weird, Steve, because I have 2 different writing careers, right? I have one career where it's kind of like professional development, right? And then I have another one that is kind of more commentary. And hopefully this book is all about kind of being a book of inspirational self-help combined with American history. So it's a bit of a different direction, but to be honest, this is the book that I wanted to write when I set out 20 years ago for a writing career, this was the book I wanted to write. So I'm so excited. I can't even tell you.
Nice. This is awesome. So it's cool to get to where you're really hoping to be. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But first, I got to remind everybody that you're a history teacher. So,
yeah, I've been teaching government and economics and history. This is my 26th year at the same high school, Bakersfield High School. I know people can't see us, but I look way too young for that, in my humble opinion. I mean, I think you'd be like, well, this guy can't have been teaching more than 20 years. But nope, the truth is 26 years, and very, very happy to be doing it. But, being in the classroom, you definitely get a bit of a privileged, I think, perspective on what's going on in your country and in your society and with young people. And my students are my inspiration. There's no question about it.
Very cool. And you are so right, by the way. You do not look a day over 22. So
yeah, right. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, that's so cool. And one of the things, I mean, you were teaching when COVID was going on, and say goodbye to seniors and all kinds of stuff. Any thoughts about that? Because we're going to attach that to where we are now with having students who, that's now not quite ancient history, but it's
the seniors in my class right now, their freshman year, they were online, right? I mean, right. And when you say teaching during COVID, I would have to put quotation marks around the word teaching. I think, I used to worry that, technology was going to displace kind of traditional classroom instruction, right? That everybody would kind of go online and they would just log in and they could take classes asynchronously and emailed in questions. And I think one of the good things about COVID and education is it reminded us about the humanity of the profession, right? That at the end of the day, it's a very tactile thing, like being in the same place, looking at kids in the eye, being able to gauge if they're engaged or if they're bored or if they're, whatever, and being in that kind of same space. That's where the magic can happen. And just simply recording lectures or, sometimes we would have live classes, of course, but what would happen is, nobody would turn on their video, so they're all in pajamas, playing on their phones, watching videos at home, not really paying any attention. And so the kind of magic and majesty of the classroom, I think, was really lost in those years. So I'm very happy to kind of get back to a traditional classroom setting.
I can only imagine, because, one of the things that I back during when COVID first started happening, I interviewed a gentleman who is he does magic, and one of his, even though, he's an actor and does other things like this, but his income was coming from doing magic performances for schools. And he suddenly had like 300 cancellations within a very short period of time back when it first started. And when I talked with him, he was in the process of reinventing himself so that he could do magic across the computer. All right. And teach you things. And one of the things he said was that one of the things that's difficult, and this is where my whole point lies, is that, he talked about how, when you do magic, you're wanting them to go ooh and ah and cheer and stuff like this. It doesn't happen so much with when you're talking through the screen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the thing we forget, is that to a certain degree, teaching is performative, right? It's very performative. And you look for a reaction when you say something that you think is interesting. You want the kids to kind of jerk their heads a little bit and go, what is that about? Or really, or, I used to be, before I became, 47 years old and just another dad to all my students, they used to find me funny. I tell my students, kids used to, I used to get you guys to laugh. I had good stories. I think I had some good one-liners. I could, do some dance moves. The kids don't find me funny anymore. I still think I'm funny. But of course they would say, well, of course you think you're funny. You're just not. But you want the laughter. You want the questions. You want the wonderment. You want the confusion. You want all that. And it goes away when it's just a blank screen. And it's just the joy of it really does vanish in many ways. So I'm happy to be back to a traditional classroom setting. And I'm sure there's the occasional kid that maybe the COVID system works better. But I would say 80 to 90% of our kids, it's better to be in a room with a human being who cares about you, that tries to have some kind of a connection to you, and can really gauge where you are in the educational process.
Oh, I totally agree with you. And there's just something totally wrong with the ability to be able to turn off the screen or the. That's.
Well, what was really weird was sometimes, these kids would have jobs, And you'd be out in the town and be like, oh, hey, Mr. Adams, I know you. You're my government teacher. I'm like, well, I have no idea who you are because you don't turn on your dang screen. I have no idea who you are. You look the same as my other 30 students, which is just a black screen. So
Jeez.
yeah, I know it was really weird, really weird. They know you, but you don't know them, which I hate. I mean, I hate that's the joy of teaching, is getting to know the kids. So
it sure is. That's just drive you nuts. So glad it's different now. And that's awesome. So why'd you start teaching? I mean, what made you say I need to be a history teacher?
Well, it's in the family profession. Both of my parents were teachers. Which made it so that when I was growing up, it was the last thing I ever wanted to do. But then when you start to get really serious about your life, when you're a junior in college, you're a senior in college, you start to think about the kind of life you want to live. If you had a good childhood the way that I did, I loved my parents. I revered my parents. My parents both came from absolutely gut-wrenching poverty, the likes of which most people can't understand, with, bad fathers, alcoholics. I mean, they had nightmarish childhoods. And yet they were somehow able to kind of raise themselves up by being teachers and provided me with an amazing childhood. And so, I'd been happy my whole life. And I'm like, that's a good life. That's vacations. That's, you're off at 3:30 every day. But most of all, my parents always had a very strong and confident and stentorian sense that they were making a difference in somebody else's life, right? They never worried about living a significant life. I see all these people who go into business and they worry about money and they worry about fame and they worry about all these other markers, these external markers of success. And they're so insecure about, am I making a difference? Am I doing with my life what I want to? Man, Steve, my parents never worried about that. They knew, because they were teachers, that there were lives that they were affecting and changing. And so, that kind of confidence, that kind of belief that your life matters because of what you do and the lives that you touch, I fell in love with that. And I thought, there's nothing better in life than to do that. And not to get too philosophical, but, I've always had a very acute sense that my life's going to end someday, that we get one life. And then at the end of the life, we get to look back and kind of judge ourselves. And when I'm sitting there in that rocking chair, hopefully as an old man, I don't want to regret my life. I want to know that I tried my best to use my freedom and my limited talents to make the world just a little bit better. And to me, education is the most certain way of doing that.
Oh, that's so powerful what you just talked about. That is so cool. There's when that someone reaches out to you, or whether they reach out, there's so many different ways they can find you today, which is a good and bad thing.
It is. Yeah.
But at the same time, there's so many cool aspects to, you run into somebody. Not too long ago, I was recently at a baseball game, and all the people in the you're walking through the different concession stand areas and all this stuff, and someone stopped and said, "Hey, you're my principal."
Know you? Yeah.
Yeah, I know you. And it's like, and then you hope, because with principal, then you hope that what they say next is, "I hate you." You don't want them to say, "I hate you." Instead, it was cool. She started talking about different stuff with their senior year and all this and things like that. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I do remember you." And and as a teacher, it's the same sort of thing, because it's so cool when somebody says to you, and you're at, one of my favorites was I was in line at a theme park, and with my family ready to go on a roller coaster, and all of a sudden behind me I get tapped on the shoulder, and someone says, "I don't know if you remember me or not, but you taught me 10th grade world history." And cool conversation took place in that line for that theme park, and I was standing there in my shorts. So
Well, and I always say, lawyers have clients and doctors have patients and artists have their symphonies or their paintings, but we teachers, we only have our students, right? And it is magical when you kind of come to contact with them again, and they'll say, that we have fond memories of your class, or you did make a difference. There is the occasional student who will come back and not have something nice to say, and that, I would say that hurts more than anything in the world. And this is kind of something we could talk about this with the book a little bit, is the way that young people look at their country. I am an unapologetic, romantic about America. That doesn't mean I think America's perfect, far from it. And we know our history has been horrendous at times. But I believe in this country, and I'm an American romantic. And I have had students who sometimes feel like, you didn't tell us the full truth of America, or, you didn't tell us the whole story, in kind of an accusatory way. And it doesn't happen very much. It has only happened maybe a handful of times. 99% of former students, it's positive, but it hurts when that happens. So I know what you're talking about.
it definitely does. Yeah, but it's such a cool thing that when you do, they connect, and especially if it's several years later after they've been out, and they do think about, they have time to think about that. They appreciate the time you spent, or the stories you told, or remember this one thing you said, and it's always stuck with me. And that's one of those.
Which, by the way, we never remember. I mean, I've had a million students say, "Do you remember when you did that? Do you remember when you did that?" Or said this. No, I don't, because I do this 5 hours a day for 27 years. I don't remember much at all. So unless it was like breaking up a fight, or winning an award, or something outlandish, I probably don't remember it. I probably told that story 100 times. So sorry. Yeah, I don't remember it. Sorry.
Then but it's such a cool thing though to have someone to actually talk with you about something like that. So
it is.
I mean, good stuff. So it's cool that you had that kind of almost a calling, because it's kind of like the family direction that you go, and I think that's neat. So all right, so you've given us a little hint about your book that we're getting ready to talk about. Let's go there. Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from, I'm going to edit this part out because I'm going to try it again.
Yeah.
So let's go there. You got your new book out. It's called Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. So tell us where the inspiration came from, and then we're going to go into some more detail.
Well, one of the things is when you teach as long as I have, right? So I've been teaching for 26 years, or as my students like to say, over a quarter of a century, to make me feel old. One of the things you do is you notice when there are kind of sudden changes, right? When there's a kind of a profound pivot in your classroom, or in the culture, or in the country, or in student attitudes and behaviors. We notice it in the classroom. We notice it first before the New York Times and the Atlantic and the Wall Street Journal and Fox News and MSNBC are doing all these specials about it. We notice it first in the classroom. And one of the things that I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years is a very disturbing change in the way that young people look at their lives and the way that they look at their country. And some of the statistics are shocking. 50% of young people say things like, "My life is not very important," or "I don't enjoy my life." One of the most disturbing statistics you will have ever heard in your life. I mean, I had to look at this 3 or 4 times to actually kind of internalize it, which is 1 out of 4 18 to 25-year-olds in America have considered suicide.
Wow.
1 out of 4. And this is when you're at you're young, you're alive, you have a joie de vivre, you're supposed to be inspired to go out and make the most of your life. That's when you don't apologize for ambition. That's when you're there to dream big and climb high and reach big. And there's something really different about the way that young people are looking at their lives. The way that people look at their country is very different. And it's not just young people, by the way, Steve, it's all people. 30% of Americans say that they're broadly dissatisfied with their lives. That number was only 10% in 2001. When you look at the G7, Americans have less confidence in their institutions than any other country of the G7 in the world. So as a people, as a civilization, we have lost confidence in our country, in our civilization, and we are personally unhappy in a lot of ways. And so, it's one thing to say, look at all these problems, but I wanted to write a book that really kind of helped young people, and actually all people, to live better and more meaningful lives. When you look at our history, it is filled with incredible, amazing, extraordinary, enchanting, pick your superlative, Steve, human beings who have this blessing that we have, the blessing of human liberty, and they were able to use their freedom and their liberty in a way that made them personally fulfilled, but also helped to essentially, make America into the country that it can and should be. So these really are lessons in liberty from 10 incredible Americans. So it's kind of a combination of history and self-help combined into one. It's very easy to look back in time and look at people from 10 years ago or 200 years ago and say, well, you got that wrong. No question, people got a lot wrong. But what would help us today is to figure out, what did they get right? And how can we apply that to our lives? So, that's what I've wanted to do, is I wanted to write a fun, accessible, inspiring book that will help people to kind of solve the problems of their own lives.
So cool, because it's so important. I especially because, to me, I think there's a lot of people that are so ahistorical that they have just no concept of what really took place or what the thoughts were. And then something you just mentioned, which is the ability to go backwards in time and take today's thoughts and put them on the people that are in those days. What do you...
That's, can I just say, that's a great point. I mean, like if you think about it, we sometimes feel like we're suspended above history. And so we can kind of look back and like we're judges, like we're sometimes, we're omniscient, like we're objectively perfect, but we're not. We are just as historical, just as broken, just as screwed up, just as ignorant as people 50 or 500 years ago. And yet I would tell you that I don't think our essential humanity has changed. I think that the way that we reach happiness, the way that we walk on a path of human flourishing hasn't changed all that much. And I think there are a lot of timeless truths about the human condition that some of the greatest Americans who have ever lived understood. And they remembered these lessons. And that's why they were able to live such successful lives. I mean, I think as human beings, we learn by example and we learn by stories. And I think a lot of these examples, because we look in the past, we're like, well, they have opinions that we don't have, and they did things that we don't agree with, so we're not going to listen to them at all. And I think that's we're really losing our heritage, and we're forgetting the life lessons that we should be remembering.
It's so crazy because there are so many life lessons, and I have. In a second, I'm going to get you to kind of look at a couple of your, whether favorite or challenging or something you learned the most about chapters here, and personalities. But one of the things that one of the errors of I have a couple degrees in history. I was a history teacher, and one of the things that's always fascinating me is thinking about the time frames that we grow up in. And so I was listening to this interview, and this gentleman, he became the speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, the vice president at the time, and Ronald Reagan was the president. And by luck and circumstance, he ends up being asked to write a speech or speeches for Ronald Reagan. And he tells this whole story, and he talks about how he came up with the speech for writing, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, open these gates." And it was fascinating from a whole different, all kinds of incredible reasons. But the most compelling reason was that he was talking about how he wanted to look at who Reagan was and going back in time and the eras that he came through, and that he grew up in eras that impacted who he was. And as he made that realization, he started looking and talking with people, because here's a man who was a Hollywood actor. So he did speech. He liked to take the speech that someone wrote and then go through and make his own changes and stuff like this, wherever evidently that's not how H.W. did things. All right. But the point was that he had this whole, and this whole thought has really gotten me thinking about the idea of the different time frames that people come up through and how it impacts who they are, what they do. And I think going back to what you just talked about a minute ago is that, the idea that, there's so many, the life lessons that the past has for us, if we give it the opportunity, are just incredible. I mean, what's it make you think about?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I found incredible when I was a college student is that you would read these, texts from Greece and Rome, as an example. You'd be reading, Aristotle's Ethics, or you'd be reading Plato's Dialogues, and you'd realize, you're reading these texts, and they're talking about the good life, and they're talking about friendship and love and justice and truth and beauty and all the finer elements, kind of the great ornamentation of life. And you're reading it and you realize, my God, these guys have been dead for thousands of years. And yet somehow their words, it's kind of like a rope through time. They can kind of yank it 2,000 years ago. And I'm feeling that inspiration today. So when Aristotle says that, the purpose of life is not merely to live, but to live well, that desire to live well lives in me, even though I'm an American, I'm a different person, different eras. And history has affected me differently, but there's a universalism, I would argue, in the aspiration to feel like your life is worthy, that your life means something. So, the 10 people I talk about in the book, some of them are famous. I mean, people like Washington and Teddy Roosevelt and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. These are people that we all know. But there are other Americans who are famous that maybe we don't know them as well, and yet they're just as inspirational. People like Arthur Ashe or Clara Barton or Daniel Inouye or Ben Nighthorse Campbell. These are incredible people, and yet they did with their lives what we're supposed to do, which is to make the most out of their time and using the blessings of liberty to do so. And I just feel like, it's silly for us not to look at these human beings and to not feel their inspiration. I mean, the way I look at it, Steve, is, these people and their history, it's like buried treasure, right? I mean, we have this buried treasure in American history, and it's not even down that deep, right? I mean, it's pretty shallow. You just need a little bit of a little bit of a utensil, and you kind of dig it up a little bit, and that shovel just works a little bit, and wow, look at these models for our life, And so, the way the book works is, I have these 10 Americans. Each one has 3 lessons for living, and some of them are very practical, like for George Washington, appearances matter. It's not a coincidence that they always wanted to put that guy in charge. Why? Because he was tall, because he was strong, because he knew that he should always wear a military uniform to official gatherings like the Second Continental Congress, right? And then sometimes the lessons are very, very broad, like Thomas Jefferson, who himself was not particularly religious, but he took religion seriously. And I think a lot of Americans today don't. We all know that we're losing religion at a level that's difficult to even comprehend. And it's not that people should or should not believe a certain thing. It's that we simply don't know what the options are. We don't know much about religion. And yet Jefferson took it very seriously his whole life. He was thinking of big questions of life and death and God and Jesus and the afterlife and morality. And I think that's an important key to the good life, is to consider these things. So, all of these people have so many lessons, again, big and small, practical and idealistic. And I just wish we would listen and kind of dig up that buried treasure a little bit.
That's so awesome. You're killing me right now, because you're inspiring me right now. I gotta go find out some more about different people. So I'm going to have to buy your book now.
Go buy the book. Buy the book. Exactly. Buy the book. Exactly.
So I got to ask this before we go some more into your book. Not really just ask. I just want to recognize this. I mean, you're published by HarperCollins, right?
Yeah, this is the imprint of HarperCollins. They talk about the big 5. You have Penguin and Random House, this is the top of the mountain for sure. This is definitely the top of the mountain. If you had told me 20 years ago, when I couldn't get a single thing like an article published, if you had told me that I would have a book coming out with HarperCollins, writing the book that I've always wanted to write. And it's not that I don't love the other books, I do, but man, I love my country and I worry about my country, and I am so inspired by some of the people in our past. They've so helped me to live a better life. And these guys do the work. I mean, if you're Arthur Ashe or you're James Madison, or you're Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I mean, these are people who are giants. They're giants. And I'm just getting the megaphone and putting it up to their mouth. That's all I'm doing, because we all need to hear, their lessons. I mean, and that's the thing, is it's a bipartisan book. I mean, there are conservatives in there, there are liberals in there, there's founding fathers in here, there's somebody who's still alive today. And so it's an American book. It really is an American book, because I want it to apply to all Americans at any point in their life. I mean, this is the thing, Steve, and this is an important point I want to make. And this is the point that Washington, kind of understood. He's kind of our first self-help president. I mean, that's the first lesson in the first chapter from George Washington, saying, embrace self-help. And that is, there is never a point in our lives where it's bad to try and be better, right? There's never a bad time to try and be a better version of ourselves. I mean, this is what, I teach seniors. They're graduating 2 weeks from tonight. And, I always say, I know that you want to be goofy. I know you want to be lazy. I know some of you maybe want to give up, or you want to be disrespectful, but there is never a bad day of your life to be inspired. There's never a bad day to learn something new. There's never a bad day to kind of cultivate a better sense of virtuosity within your soul. Just because you're graduating, just because you're 80 years old, just because you're already famous or successful, doesn't mean that tomorrow can't be better than today. So that's why I wrote the book.
That's awesome. I love it. This is cool. Do you have at least one or two revelations that you went, oh my gosh, this is really cool. I did not know this.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, what's interesting, and this is a great question, by the way, great question, is, I've taught political science my whole life. So, I mean, some of these people I knew a lot about, right? I mean, there's a chapter about Abraham Lincoln, So obviously I knew some of these people, right? And I'll tell you, it's interesting, the chapters that I knew a lot about the people already were actually the harder ones to write. Because how do you distill down, I think Lincoln might be one of the 4 or 5 greatest human beings to have ever lived, and so how do you just kind of distill that down?
Right.
But I'll tell you what I really enjoyed was learning about the people who I didn't know all that much about. You really dig deep into the life of Arthur Ashe or Senator Daniel Inouye. And what you realize is, yeah, we have President's Day, and we all know your Lincoln or your Teddy Roosevelt, but we should be celebrating people like Daniel Inouye. Daniel Inouye was a Japanese American who was in Honolulu the day of Pearl Harbor. He was a second generation Japanese American. And because of that, he was not allowed to fight for his country. And he had to petition FDR to do it. And he finally goes and he becomes part of the most decorated fighting group in the history of the American military. And then he loses his right arm 3 days before the end of World War II. And when he has to take the oath of office, he has to do it with his left hand. And the stories go on and on and on. There's this great, and you talk about being surprised, there's this great story about Daniel Inouye where his father is dropping him off. And there's a good chance he's never going to see his son again, right? I'm dropping him off to go fight in World War II. Right. You're good chance he's going to die. And what does his father say? His father turns to him and says, "This country, America, has been good to us. It has given us jobs. It has educated us. And if you have to die for your country, do not dishonor your family and do not dishonor your nation." Wow. Nobody, Steve, talks like that anymore.
No.
Right? Nobody talks like that anymore. And think about it. Nowadays, if people have the slightest criticism of America, they won't say the Pledge of Allegiance. They won't, and again, this guy had a real beef. People who looked like him were literally going into concentration camps on the west coast of California. And yet he said, you know what? Our country isn't perfect. And I'm going to fight, not because it's perfect, but to make it perfect. Because the ideals of this country are worth defending and renewing, right? And that ideal of America in perpetuity is an ideal that we just don't talk about. And that guy deserves, we should have a Daniel Inouye Day. He's just incredible. If I could tell one other story about him.
Sure.
Most people know Bob Dole. Bob Dole was a Republican, right? He was a Republican nominee in 1996. We all know that he couldn't use one of his arms. I don't know if people remember that. They actually went to the same hospital in Michigan to recover. It took 1 or 2 years for them to recover from their World War II wounds. And in 2012, when Daniel Inouye died, Bob Dole was in a wheelchair by that point. And he was in his 90s. And there's this amazing moment. In the year 2024, where Republicans and Democrats can't agree that spring comes after winter, I want you to consider this moment where Bob Dole, Republican, Daniel Inouye, right, Democrat, when he goes to the rotunda to look at his coffin, Bob Dole stands up and he salutes the coffin. He says, "Danny would not have wanted to see me in a wheelchair." My God.
Wow.
These are men who understood the magical melody of America is bigger than a party. It's bigger than an ideology. It has done so much for the cause of human freedom. And these guys got it. Right? They loved America, and they loved it more than they loved themselves. And they sure as hell loved it more than they loved their political party. Sorry, I get emotional because we just don't talk about those stories, and we need to know them.
You got that right. And you're right on all front there. We don't talk about them, and something you said before. They get mad at some little thing and they think, "Oh, this is the worst place ever." And it's like, well, I'm not so sure. Maybe you need to go visit some of those places.
Yeah, exactly. The most important voting people do is with their feet, and people want to come here. Why? Not because this country is perfect, far from it, but because things can happen here that can't happen in other parts of the world, right? And again, what I want people to appreciate is that the greatness of this country didn't happen on accident. Right. It didn't happen on accident, right? There are people like the 10 men and women in this book who built this nation. And here's the thing. Democracies wither, they die, they decay, unless we do the heavy lifting to renew them, right? And these men and women did their part to renew the blessings of their country because they believed in our principles, they believed in the institutions. It is so dang easy to destroy institutions. It's easy to have a revolution. It's impossible sometimes to build and to renew. And that's why I'm scared about our cynicism. I'm terrified of how Americans, a lot of young Americans, reflexively don't like their country. 40% of Gen Zers say that the founding fathers were villains. And I don't know if you saw this. There was a poll a few years ago in England, but I know it applies here as well, where they asked the question, if your country was attacked, if it was invaded, would you flee or would you stay and fight for your nation? And a majority said, I wouldn't fight.
Wow. I did not.
That is terrifying because we are living in this incredible kind of mirage of human history where we have freedom, where we have opportunity. I mean, imagine if you didn't know if you were black or white, gay or straight, rich or poor, northern or southern, and you had to pick a time and a place in the history of the world to be born. You would pick right now, right here. That didn't happen on accident.
I love that. You know, one of the things that really, just comes to mind. Well, first of all, I do not understand how, unless you experience other things before you start complaining about stuff, it's like, but it seems to be first nature, especially on social media and such. They share, that, how terrible this is and that is. And it's like, so what are you comparing this to? And I gotta go back to this. One of the things that drives me nuts as a history person is that, when you put whatever modern day thoughts are on the past, one of the problems that you have to think about is that's not how they saw the world. They don't see it how you see it.
That is, oh my gosh, that's a brilliant point. I hope your listeners can hear me like clapping right here. I mean, that is so true. It's like, it is so easy to look back and say what people got wrong according to the value system and the lens that we have today, right? So like when you go back and you look at the founding fathers, they are on the other side of the Industrial Revolution. They are on the other side of the Civil Rights era. They're on the other side of the Civil War. They are on the other side of Darwin and Marx and Freud and two world wars. I mean, like, so you can't impose your lens onto them. That doesn't mean that they were right in things that they did. Absolutely not. But people kind of accept the world in which they are born, and you have to change it in the way that with the powers and the talents and the resources you have in your time. And so, the question is not what is the perfect world. The question is, how do we make the world that we have inherited into a little bit of a better place? Remember, the preamble does not talk about a perfect union. It talks about a more perfect union, and really, one of the things that I learned when writing the book is that the greatness of our country is not that we have all the answers. It's the fact that we know how to have conversations where we find the answers, right? And that's why, when you look at some of the lessons we talk about, one of my favorite lessons is from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just passed away a few years ago. And I'm a bit more of a conservative person. So, I didn't love her decisions sometimes in the Supreme Court, but man, she lived an amazing American life. And her best friend on the court is an arch conservative hero, Antonin Scalia, right? And they were great friends, right? And they couldn't disagree more when it came to their decisions, but they spent New Year's Eve together. They traveled to India together. They loved opera. And obviously they loved the law. And yet, people today are mystified by that friendship. Well, that's because, they didn't forget that we should all have friends who have different opinions than we do, right? That an echo chamber is not good for the spirit. It's not good for the soul. It's not good for the brain, right? And both of those Americans, Scalia and Ginsburg, they respected their friends so much that they thought to themselves, this is a person of good character. This is the person who loves America. Maybe I'm not getting something. Maybe I'm not right. God forbid we actually ask the question, maybe I'm not right all the time. And that's why that friendship worked, right? Is because that friendship made each of them better, right? They both understood their own thoughts and the thoughts of other people in a way that realized that what unites us, Steve, is way stronger than what divides us. And you need friendships that do that. And nowadays we have a lot of people who will say, I don't want to be a friend with somebody who votes opposite of I do. I don't. If I'm a mega Republican, if you don't love Trump, I don't want to be your friend. Or if I'm riding with Biden, I can't be friends with somebody who votes for the Republican. And that we're losing so much of what's possible in life when we only befriend people who think the way that we do.
Yeah, that's so right. Expert after expert who talks about leadership, one of the first things they tell you is don't hire people around you who are like you. Find the people who are going to challenge you and to achieve what it is you want to achieve, instead of saying, "Oh yes, you're correct." Yeah, because I think the same way you do.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, like one of the not to kind of keep dropping names, but like one of the lessons of Madison is always be willing to change your mind. Right? Always be willing to change your mind. I mean, if you have the same opinions at 50 as you had at 18, that's pathetic, man. That's right. Sad. I mean, and by the way, James Madison was changing his mind on some pretty dang big things, right? I mean, like, the biggest thing of all was, Madison thought that we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights, right? You get to the end of the Constitutional Convention, and you get George Mason from Virginia stands up. He says, "Hey, we need to have a Bill of Rights," and everybody groans like, "Oh my God, no!" We've been here since May. We smell. We're tired. We just want to go home with our families. We don't need to write a Bill of Rights. And then when Madison gets to the ratification debate in Virginia, and he hears from Hamilton up in New York, what he realizes is actually a Bill of Rights actually makes sense. Like, we actually maybe should do that. And that allowed him to ratify the Constitution. It allowed him to win his seat against his friend against Mason in Virginia. James Monroe. And so, that ability to change your mind, to be nimble, that's an important part of life, to be able to change your mind on big issues. It's important. And I think he models that brilliantly.
It's so cool. I mean, and getting back to, your title talking about 30 rules for living. I mean, the life lessons that are there, that if we allow them to be there and stop trying to, put them into some shoebox because somebody told us that this is the way to think, is because it's amazing to me. Because going back to something you said before, I mean, one of the things is that where they were in history, what experiences they had. And so to think about being in a time before the railroad, because the railroad ushers in all kinds of aspects that are happening with the Industrial Revolution and such. And, plus suddenly the time it takes to go certain distances, and they're all before that. And when you come in after that, you think about the things that are happening, down the road. The impact of the ages, I just think it's just amazing.
And if I could actually make, like, this is kind of the whole point of the book, is that, and I don't want to be too kind of geeky. I don't want to geek out too much, but there was a Greek historian named Plutarch, and, Plutarch's Lives. And Plutarch wrote about, almost 50 of them, I believe, the lives of different, Greeks and Romans who had significant impact on their societies in the world. As Plutarch says, he's not worried about like the grand headlines of life and the battle and the position and the glory. He says he's interested about the souls of men. Well, here's the thing, Steve. Plutarch was the historian that inspired the founding fathers so much. George Washington wanted to be like Cato. John Adams wanted to be like Cicero. Good old, Hamilton loved Julius Caesar and said he was the greatest man that ever lived. James Madison wanted to be like Helvidius, right? And yet think about it. My goodness, how much distance was there between Greece and Rome and the founding fathers? And yet those guys were inspired by those guys, and there's 2,000 years separating. I am trying to be kind of this sounds arrogant, but I'm trying to kind of do like an American version of Plutarch. I'm trying to say, look, you don't need to go to Greece and Rome, which is great. I love Greece and Rome, but you have men and women from our history who can inspire you, can do for you what Plutarch, if Plutarch can create, an Adams, a Jefferson, a Madison, a Hamilton, then good God, what can our Americans do for us today? Great men and women we're just ready to be inspired. The embers of greatness are out there, but we've got to stoke them a little bit and let the best Americans do it.
You got that right. It's so cool, especially one of the things as I'm listening to you talk about this that just kind of pops in my head is that they learned that you could learn from history.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's the whole thing is that we now look at history like we bludgeon it like with a cudgel. Like we look back and we use it as a way to feel better about ourselves because they were so wrong. That is the exact wrong way to look at it. You can look back and say we made mistakes. We should learn from them for sure. But we should also be inspired by them. What did people get right that we can apply to our lives today? That's why I keep saying people learn through stories, right? We learn through inspiring stories. And we're just not learning about people like, I mean, I haven't mentioned, Arthur Ashe very much. I haven't talked about Clara Barton very much. I mean, these are stories that we should learn and we should be inspired by. I mean, Arthur Ashe, I mean, there's a guy who, we think about him as a tennis star, but here's a guy who was really at the forefront in raising the consciousness of America and saying that we should not be, that we should be aware of the evils of racial apartheid in South Africa. We just take it for granted that Americans were against that and that we, loved Nelson Mandela. But the man who made that into the biggest issue was a tennis player, right? A guy from Virginia who really felt like he didn't do much for civil rights early on and decided I was late to the game in civil rights. I'm going to be ahead of the game when it comes to apartheid and making sure that we in the West do something about it. I mean, this is a guy that won Wimbledon, right? So, I mean, his story is just so incredible, and Arthur Ashe reminds us that we can all change the world in our own way. I mean, there's this great story in the 1970s where Jesse Jackson is actually in Atlanta. They're at a party of an Atlanta Hawks basketball player. And he goes up to Arthur Ashe and he says, you know what? Your problem, Arthur, is that you're just not arrogant enough. And Arthur Ashe looks at Jesse Jackson and says, you know what? You're right. I'm not, right? And I don't need to be, and so, Arthur Ashe was this just beautiful, elegant man. And he made the world a better place in his own way. We all need to absorb that, right? We don't have to be loud. We don't have to be bombastic. We can do it in our own way.
So powerful, so powerful. And it's, oh my gosh, it's just, this is exciting. Congratulations on your new book again, Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. And they need to rush out and get a copy. But before we go any further, if people wanted to connect with you, learn more about you, Jeremy, where would you send them?
Yeah. I actually have a website now. Now this is a big time publisher, big book. JeremySAdamsAuthor.com is my website. You can obviously go to Amazon, look at my author page. You can follow me on Twitter at JeremyAdams6, JeremyAdams6. And please buy the book, share the book. Again, I'm not a famous person, but I do feel like I'm writing about people in a book that should be famous.
Awesome. I got two last questions I want to ask you, and they have to do with writing. How do you start? How do you deal with that first blank page?
Well, I mean, like for a book like this, you have to write the introduction in 2 chapters before you can even get an agent, right? And so that's that's usually not a problem for me, though. I'm big on just like when I have an idea, like sometimes I'll start with just a phrase that I like. I'll have like something. I read a lot, of course, and so like I'll see a phrase or a quote, and I'm like, I want to play with that a little bit. And so you kind of starts with this big idea. And then you need to distill it and figure, well, what do I want to do with this? And I'll be honest, all these writers, these famous writers out there, they talk about, I have to wake up at 5 a.m. and I need my coffee and I do it at this time in this place. You know what, man? I got 3 kids, 2 jobs, and a writing career. You know when I write? When it's quiet. That's when I do it. And so I'm the least pretentious writer in the world. But I do believe in the power of words and ideas to change the world. And I've worked very hard my whole life to be able to get to this point where I can write this book. And I'm terrified that it's not going to be read and that it's not going to be bought. And I believe in it more than anything I've ever done in my life as a writer. And I really hope people will read it. I'm very confident that if people read it, people will recommend it to others. It's inspiring. It's easy to read. It's not that long.
Awesome. And, the last question I want to ask you, it's sticking with the theme of talking about writing techniques here. One of the things I want to ask you about is when you're writing and you're kind of in that flow, and then all of a sudden you get stuck.
Yeah.
What do you do to get unstuck?
Oftentimes, I will take a break, right? I take a break, or I mark it and say, I will come back to this later. To me, I wrote this book in the middle of the school year, which I've never done before. All my other books were written during the summertime, right? And but when you get this opportunity and this contract to write a book with this amazing publisher, and they have been amazing to work with. My editor is this extraordinary woman who's got an IQ of about 180. She's just so smart, and she's just guided this book so well, and she's just been so great. You gotta get to work immediately. So to me, writing is like a diet. You got to get your steps in. Well, when you're writing, you got to get your words in, right? So you have the due date. Well, how long do I want to revise? I want 2 months to revise. Okay, fine. That means rough draft has to be done by this date. Okay, well, then that means, you're writing an introduction, a conclusion, and 10 chapters. So that means you got to write a chapter a month. Okay, well, how long do you want the chapters to be? So how many days a week are you writing? So that means every time you sit down, you've got to get to, so many words. So for me, like I would not get up and be done until I had 500 to 600 words. And I just, if that took a half an hour, great. If that took 3 hours, great. But you just kind of have to be on a word diet. And I'm a very slow writer. People think because I talk fast, I write fast. It's the exact opposite.
Nice. Thank you for sharing. And thank you so much for talking to us today about your latest book, Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. Jeremy, it's been awesome. Thank you so much. Awesome talk. And I just awesome book.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching, Learning, Leading K12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching, Learning, Leading K12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching, Learning, Leading K12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.